There are a lot of people that are as passionate about the Andy Griffith Show as I am. I watch at least 2 episodes a day, sometimes more than that. And I've been doing that year after year. The television show never grows old to me. The acting on all the characters is just top notch. You just don't see sitcoms this well done. The writing was phenomenal, and Andy Griffith was a big part of this. He directed a lot of this show by knowing what would work with his audience. And when I say directed, I don't mean actually physically directed the show, but he was more of a leader. He was a leader on the set, and he was a workhorse. He believed in having fun, but he also believed in making a production that was top notch. That's what makes this show one of the most beloved shows of all time. It was produced by Sheldon Leonard, who is also the producer of another famous show, The Danny Thomas Show. And that's the connection between The Danny Thomas Show and The Andy Griffith Show. Andy first starred in an episode of The Danny Thomas Show. Although Danny Thomas Enterprises was the production company of the show, Andy Griffith was able to get himself half ownership of the show when he landed the role of Sheriff Andy Taylor. I think this is a phenomenal achievement to start with. We all know the basic storyline for the show, where Andy plays a widowed sheriff and he's raising his young son named Opie, and the entire premise of the show is the daily lives of the characters in the town of Mayberry. And we all know what an amazing deputy Barney Fife was. And this is another point that's key to the longevity of this show, the relationship between the Barney Fife character and Andy Taylor. A true friendship comes across the small screen. You can just feel it in their actions and ways, the things they say to each other, and the way they respond to each other. Now, the show evolved in a number of ways. A lot of people don't really like to watch the first 2 seasons, and I happen to be one of those. It doesn't mean that I won't watch it, but I just don't like those seasons as well. My favorite seasons are seasons 3, 4, and 5. At that point, the show had begun to get traction, and each character knew its roles. For some reason, I think it took that long for each of the actors to get really comfortable and live the part that they were playing. During the first season of the show, Andy Griffith portrays a character that's kind of a country bumpkin that resemble the characters that Andy Griffith played in previous movies. But as the show progressed, Andy decided to begin portraying his character as a more serious and sensible character. This change in that character later proved to be one of the strong points of the show. I firmly believe, had Andy not done this, we wouldn't be having this conversation about the importance of the Andy Griffith Show. I don't think it would have lasted anywhere near the length of time that it did. His character originally was too put on. It wasn't natural, and that was pretty obvious. And that's the reason some people find those early episodes kind of uncomfortable to watch. Andy doesn't seem relaxed at all. It seems almost like a stage production. Once he figured out that he needed to play the straight man and that Barney needed to be the funny guy, along with a bunch of other characters like Otis, Goober, Gomer, Andy was always the common sense side of everything. The other thing that made this show just amazing was the acting of Ron Howard. It doesn't get any better than this with a child star. If you watch interviews of the cast and crew of the Andy Griffith Show, they all state that Ron Howard was way above his years as far as an actor. Ron was only 6 years old when he got cast for the show to play Opie. Because he was so very young, his dad, Rance, was around the set a lot. Rance himself was an actor, but he wasn't a typical stage mom type burden to the production. He was more of a help than a hindrance. No one ever minded his dad being on the set. In fact, his contributions were very much appreciated. When Ron began, he couldn't even read. He didn't know what the script said, so his dad would go over the script with him to help his son memorize the lines. Now here's the first point that I want to touch on that really was a change, and an upward change in the show. This is much like Andy Griffith deciding to play the straight man, and that was the way that Opie was played. Early on, the character of Opie was quite different. It was more like your typical sitcom kids, where he would constantly do wisecracks and comebacks or jokes and punchlines, things like that. But here comes Rance Howard to the rescue. He sits down with Andy Griffith and talks to him about what he thinks this character should be played like. Now, just the thought of that sounds like a monumental disaster about to happen. You would think that Andy Griffith would probably say, "You need to get off the set and mind your own business and let us make this sitcom." But that's not what happened. Rance went on to explain to Andy that he didn't think the relationship between his son and Andy should be like a normal sitcom. He thought that Opie ought to be played like that he knew that his dad was much smarter than he was, and that he respected his dad. And this was totally opposed to most sitcom kids that were constantly trying to make their dad look bad. Andy Griffith took this conversation to heart. Consequently, he created a respectful, well-mannered character in Opie. As a result of this, and we really need to thank Rance Howard for his influence, Mayberry was able to continue to live up to its TV show reputation as a kind of utopia that we all try to achieve. This change also helped establish Andy Taylor as the premier TV dad in the 1960s. Now, Ron Howard admits that his relationship with his own father shaped the Andy Griffith Show. The relationship they had was a really positive one, and they were exceptionally close. So this made it real easy for Andy Griffith to base his character on the relationship that really existed with Ron Howard and his dad. This is something that few actors are able to say, that they had a great relationship with their stage parent. Now, the second thing that really changed the Andy Griffith Show was not a good thing in my book. The show came at a time during a transition among the United States in the television industry. Networks switched from black and white to color television. During this time period, many shows made the change, but the Andy Griffith Show had markedly the biggest change. If you look on the internet today, you will find forums upon forums of fans discussing why they hate the colorized seasons. And I have to admit, I am one of them. I don't like the color versions of the show, but that was a changing of the times. There were also some major upsets that were happening at the same time. Mayberry had a new sheen and a glow and made it more vibrant than it had been. For the first time, the town looked like the town right down the road. It wasn't mythical or magical anymore. Mayberry was always supposed to represent small-town America and the simple charms that it held. But these black and white era episodes put it into mythology. There is a certain feeling that you achieve when you watch a black and white episode of the Andy Griffith Show. It's like a fantasy in your mind. Mayberry seemed like the ideal way of life. The lack of color created a mood and a sense for the place. The black and white imagery created a sense of nostalgia, a longing for a time that never quite existed like it did on TV on the Andy Griffith Show. The other thing that affected it greatly, and probably one thing that makes it seem so bad when we view a color episode, is the fact that Don Knotts left the show at this time. Changing to color stripped the show somewhat of its charm and gave it more of a modern sensibility. Like I said earlier, the biggest thing would be the fact that Don Knotts left the show. He would make an occasional, usually 2 episodes a season, return to Mayberry. But even these shows were just not the same. The charms of Mayberry just felt upended. The other thing that really seems to affect this time period is that Andy Griffith looked slightly bored in his role. I think he was down out depressed and upset with the changes that had been made to the program. He didn't like doing the show without his buddy Barney Fife there. It really feels like Andy is tiring of Mayberry in it. But now don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to discourage you from watching the color versions. You just have to look at them a little bit differently. I still enjoy them, but given the choice, I will always watch seasons 3, 4, or 5. But the colorized seasons do have some pretty strong supporters. It's true that Mayberry never looked so crisp and colorful as it did in the later seasons. And one of the things I really enjoy about the color versions is you get a real good aspect of what the 40 Acres backlot really looked like. You get to know what Andy, Barney, Aunt Bee, and Helen really saw when they were filming the show. The bottom line to all this is I feel like the last 3 seasons of the Andy Griffith Show were really a sequel rather than a continuation of the original project. Continue watching the Andy Griffith Show. You can't go wrong. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll continue to chase the classics.